Thank you, David, for a great intro video. I'd like now to welcome Mira Lane to give our keynote. Mira is the Partner Director of Ethics and Society within Cloud and AI at Microsoft. She runs a multidisciplinary team within an engineering context that's responsible for guiding technical and experience innovation towards ethical, responsible, and sustainable outcomes. The technology areas of interest to her team include speech and language, computer vision, ambient devices, intelligent meetings, intelligent agents, and mixed reality, AR, VR, HoloLens. Mira's history at Microsoft is focused on experience strategy, incubation of new concepts, and bringing products to the market. She holds numerous patents across platforms and collaborative interfaces, and she's held various roles throughout her technology career in development, product management, UX architect, and design. Mira has a background in art, computer science, and mathematics, and her video has been featured in film festivals and galleries. So I would like to welcome you, Mira, and if you want to share your screen, and I will give you the screen.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let me just share my desktop. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I am honored to speak to all of you today. Let me see if I can just move this little Zoom icon around. Okay. I am super honored to speak to all of you today, and I hope this virtual conference has been enlightening to everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about tech and how we do some of the ethics work on the ground at Microsoft. And I think we all recognize that we're in the midst of a shift in technological capabilities. In tech like AI, they have the potential to significantly change the way we work and create, interact with each other. So as Myra mentioned, I love our Myra-Mira combination. I have the opportunity to work with engineering teams really about developing and releasing tech in a responsible way. So today I thought it might be interesting for you to find a little bit more about how we're approaching that and maybe gain a bit of an appreciation about the challenges and complexities that exist in this space. Myra mentioned this, so I'll kind of zoom through this, but a little bit about me. I graduated from the University of Waterloo with a bachelor's of mathematics. I majored in computer science. I'm also an artist. I do a lot of different types of work, from ceramics to making music, painting, printmaking, and even creating experimental video art. And so I worked at Nuance after I graduated from the University of Waterloo, but the majority of my career has been at Microsoft for about 16 years. And the team I'm going to talk about today is called Ethics and Society. It's a team I created, and we work in the depths of the AI platform across technologies like speech, vision, language, people understanding, so many other technologies, really at the heart of where we're developing a lot of our core AI technology at Microsoft. And I've had the pleasure of being able to span so many different roles, from PM to development and design, research. And so I like to have that perspective as I come to this space. I'm also Canadian, and so I bring that kind of Canadian mindset into a lot of this. And I have 2 kids, so it's a pretty busy and active life. And I wanted to start by talking about what it means to critically examine the industry which we're all in. And I think it's incredibly valuable for us to have a history of computing in sight. And I'm reminded of some of the observations of George Dyson. If you don't know who he is, he's a legendary historian of technology. He's a philosopher. And I remember sitting next to him at an event discussing the evolution of tech and its relation to society. And he's very interesting because he grew up around Alan Turing and John von Neumann when they were building the first computers. And Turing and von Neumann both believed that the future belonged to non-deterministic computation and statistical probabilistic models and codes. And so at the time, the von Neumann project was funded to do H-bomb calculations. And if they designed this ultimate weapon, they could have this fantastic machine. And so I love this quote from George Dyson, where he talks about technology in the form of cathedrals. And he says, cathedrals were built over hundreds of years by thousands of nameless people, each one of them carving a little corner somewhere or adding a little stone. That's how I feel about the whole computational universe. Everyone is putting these small stones in place, incrementally creating this cathedral that no one could ever imagine doing on their own. And it's a little sobering, but this is what we're all a part of. And understanding this journey is something that helps us critically examine the present. So it's been an incredible journey. It's been an incredible history of economical and technical transformation with key themes around innovation and breakthrough and scale, efficiency, productivity, war, entertainment, advertising, monetization. And we could easily spend this hour just exploring any one of these key moments. It's really quite incredible. But given that we only have a short period of time, so I thought we could fast forward to about the last decade or so of progress and what the world looked like just over 10 years ago at the introduction of the iPhone. I don't know if everyone remembers that anymore, but do you remember what life looked like back in 2009 when the iPhone was just 1 year old? And back in 2009, this was the end of a massive financial crisis where the Dow Jones Industrial Average had lost over 54% from 2 years ago, from October 2007 to about March of 2009. So it was a massive moment in our financial history, in our economic times. And by the end of 2009, having a basic cell phone that looked like this just wasn't good enough anymore, as advanced as those seemed at the time. And there was the App Store. It was about 5 months old. And if you remember that slogan, there's an app for that. It was home to about 25,000 apps. And now the Apple App Store serves as one of the most important software stores on the planet. It has over 2 million apps, over 20 million registered developers. Its revenue has topped over $100 billion over that last decade-long lifespan. And interestingly, the Google Play Store has 2.7 million apps. And these numbers, both these numbers, have been steadily increasing over the years. Back then, the apps were a little weird. Developers and users were still enjoying the power and fun of iPhone's multi-touch display and motion sensors, like this cute little beer drinking app that got everyone using these apps and playing around with them. Amazon had just released the Kindle 2. Google introduced an app that was meant to transform the communication space. It was a magical new, web app called Google Wave, and that combined email and messaging and social media and event planning. And there are a lot of parallels between Wave and Slack and Microsoft Teams, and even what Facebook is actually doing now. And perhaps Google Wave was well ahead of its time. And then in January of 2009, Facebook surpassed MySpace in US traffic. Facebook grew to about 68.5 million US visitors that year. And this trend we all know has only continued. Facebook now has over 2.7 billion active users, monthly active users. Amazing. And then back then in 2009, there was a video that shocked so many of us. It rallied the world around a movement. Neda Aga Sultan, she was 26 years old. She was shot dead. And it was captured by cell phone and uploaded to Facebook and YouTube. The video quickly went viral on Twitter. And what happened here was Neda's death actually set the stage for an era of social media activism. And never before had citizens in crisis been able to disseminate their stories so easily to millions of strangers around the world. And Connect was first announced, and this brought multi-person skeletal tracking, face recognition, voice recognition to the mainstream, making you the controller. And this left a lasting mark on the technology world. These features soon began to percolate throughout the tech industry. And I just had to throw this in because I think Minecraft is just so sweet. Minecraft was publicly announced and had a major cultural impact. It's changed the way that video games are perceived in schools. Teachers began using Minecraft in their classrooms to teach various lessons, from circuitry to coding to history to language, math. And having this customizable 3D setting gave them the opportunity to teach lessons in a new and interactive way. And the amazing thing is that Minecraft still looks like this over a decade later. So this is just really sweet. But that era felt noticeably different than the space that we occupy right now. And I think we can all recognize that. It felt blind to the harms of technology, a little naive, and tech was viewed through a lens of optimism. So Then let's fast forward, okay, 2009 to the winter of 2012, because this was a moment in shift as well. And most of us completely missed what happened in 2012 at the time. Prior to 2012, the world of AI looked something like this, with classical machine learning driving the majority of the work in AI, and a very small branch of people pursuing neural networks. But in the winter of 2012, 3 people, led by Geoffrey Hinton, broke open the world of deep learning. And every year there's something that some of us would call the Nerd Super Olympics of computer vision. It's called the ImageNet Challenge. And it was at that competition that we saw this breakthrough in deep learning. So to set the watermark of where we were as a human species at that point in time, I'm going to backtrack to 6 months earlier, to the summer of 2012. And at that time, Google had assembled a dream team of 12 people around computer vision. And some of you might remember this. They trained their brain to recognize cat videos after watching millions of YouTube videos. And it got a massive write-up in Wired and the New York Times, and all the nerd sites were buzzing. And at the time, it seemed really quite crazy. But what did we learn from that? Well, if you have 12 of the smartest people in the world and lots of computers, lots and lots and lots of computers, 16,000 computers, you too could recognize cat videos from millions of YouTube videos. And it's in the shadow of this accomplishment, just so you understand how quickly things changed in the span of 6 months, where this breakthrough in AI and deep learning happened. So when the Olympics came in for computer vision, 3 radicals led by Geoffrey Hinton walked through the door, and they brought in a model trained on 2 GPUs. So we had 3 people, 2 GPUs. And what was the result? Well, they just obliterated every single competitor in every single category. And it was at this moment, when 3 people and 2 GPUs walked in, that most corporations started pivoting around AI. This was a milestone moment where they broke open deep learning. And it was a combination of massive amounts of data, new mass, and horsepower. And since the winter of 2012, there's been this explosion of technologies. And we've achieved human performance on benchmarks across speech recognition, machine translation, machine reading and comprehension, image captioning, conversational question answering. And this has produced leaps in capabilities in AI. There have been big breakthroughs across various industries in medical, agriculture, big pharma, autonomous vehicles, data centers, and it's been really quite amazing. And some would say that we're living in an age of magic. And there's been breakthroughs in the creative process, and it's a question that I've been preoccupied with what AI means for artists and the types of tools that will emerge. And there are questions around originality, authorship, copyright, and whether machines can truly be creative. And so a few years ago, I worked with some researchers here at MSR to create a generative adversarial network that could mimic my artwork. I wanted to see where technology was at the time and whether I could replace myself with a machine. And so here's an example of my original piece of artwork. And we took about 75,000 images of my original artwork and trained a neural net to learn in the style of Mira. And so this is all original artwork. And what we did was we created a neural net, and that outputted some rather interesting images. And while none of these would be considered a finished piece, I was surprised by the themes that emerged, like the eyeball in the clouds is not something I would ever have created, but it felt like it was in the style of me. And some of these pieces that could be the beginnings of new projects. And I'll admit that it wasn't entirely satisfying as an artist, but I think there's a potential opportunity here that we should be exploring. And speaking of the creative field, I was talking to Perry Nightingale last week, the head of creative AI at WPP, which is the world's largest advertising company. And he's been doing some interesting explorations around technology and the technology of marketing, and how tech and social media have shaped our perceptions of beauty in potentially harmful ways. In particular, the ethics of AI-driven, hyper-targeted advertising, and advertising that is so tuned so that it appeals specifically to you so that you'd click on it. And we're touching on some really thorny questions at this moment, right? And in today's debate, the flip side of all of this transformative technology, we're no longer looking at tech in that blind, simplistic, utopian view. The debate on the dystopian side is equally real. There's questions around bias, how we handle biometrics in a responsible way. What does it mean to have a corporation that's acting responsibly? How do we think about deep fakes and synthetic media? And most importantly, all of these unintended consequences of technology that starts to get woven together in this ecosystem. And so we've come to recognize the incredible power and pervasiveness of social media. We're seeing this right now as well in our current democracy. We've seen the power of face recognition technologies. And in a political climate where both sides can't seem to agree on anything, both sides agree that this category of tech should require regulation. And many corporations like Microsoft also agree that this requires regulation. We're seeing incredible leaps in the ability to generate synthetic media. So last year we saw the ability to create volumetric versions of people from photographs to being able to clone voices using small samples of recorded audio. And these can be leveraged in deeply harmful ways. And so there's a massive shift in the capabilities of technology and also in the general societal perception of how tech fits into our lives. There's been questions of mass surveillance, the effects of technology companies like Airbnb on our communities and neighborhoods. There's questions of accountability, how to handle privacy in smart cities, the role of technology in the current COVID situation. And these are really complex issues. And for the most part, a lot of companies have started with principles. There's a flurry of principles, an overload of them actually. And we want to approach all this technology in a really thoughtful way. And we've all recognized that we're designing societally complex systems and cultures, and these are impacting our landscapes, our interactions. And I personally feel that our language is poorly suited to describe this complexity of tech. And I think it defies our normal cause and effect metaphors. And we're learning that we have to examine technology in context. It's often dual use, and it's difficult to separate the good from the bad. So we hear this a lot from our CEO at Microsoft. Satya has been incredibly bold, him and Brad Smith, our president, in how we approach AI. We've created a lot of internal groups and processes to help us responsibly develop our technologies. And so this is where groups like mine come in. I run Ethics in Society. It's deeply embedded in the development stack. And we're guides. We work with tech teams to deliver technology in a responsible way. And we come at this with the mindset of a stewardship and conservative society, because we recognize that our decisions that we take today may have possible destructive impact over the long term. And so I thought I'd walk you through some of the things we're working on and how we're approaching responsible innovation. But I want to start with a couple caveats. First of all, we don't have all the answers. It's really impossible for us to anticipate ahead of time all the new ecosystems and unique circumstances surrounding tech. And then also with every development of technology, there's new domains of ignorance that are discovered, stuff that we just don't know and understand. And so we have to be very intentional about listening and creating mechanisms to hear that signal and then rapidly iterate our methodologies. And I want to recognize that we're building on an enormous amount of work from others, and that teams like mine are just a piece of the puzzle. We're not like the whole puzzle, we're just a piece of that cathedral. So I'll share a framework that I use around how to think about responsible innovation in the engineering culture. It's really about 5 elements: reflexivity, inclusivity, anticipation, responsiveness, and intentionality. And I'll walk through each of those a little bit more in depth and give some examples. And so the first one is about reflexivity. And this is really about avoiding moral distancing and the desire to look away. It's acknowledging that there's different views and value systems, that we fit into a larger ecosystem. And we've been doing a lot of work on shaping the organizational culture, creating spaces of psychological safety, because it's about people, and people build technology. And some of our most important work is shaping the mindset of our workforce and creating space to have difficult conversations. So we've inserted a lot of checkpoints in our system and created intentional friction to help us examine the work that's happening. And so a few interesting highlights. I'll start with a game that we created. It's called Judgment Call. It helps people exercise their moral imagination and test their analytical thinking. And it helps people apply our ethical principles to understand how product or technology could be used to either help or harm society. And so the way it works is there are 3 types of cards: cards that represent our ethical principles, cards that represent rating from 1 to 5, and then cards that represent all the various stakeholders, direct or indirect, of your technology. So you draw 1 card from each of those piles, and depending on the combination you get, you write a product review from the perspective of that stakeholder. And this teaches you a lot of things: the need to get real stakeholder input, for example, and how to learn to examine and interrogate your project in a way that you might not have in the past. And so you'd be really surprised at how valuable an exercise like this is in creating psychological safety in the context of gameplay, because it forces you to get into that mindset and it makes it okay to start critiquing your technology. Here's another example. We've been experimenting with incorporating our ethics principles into our personal commitments, how we reward people, the objectives and key results of our leaders. And so in our workshops, we've helped people write out their commitments around responsible innovation and being able to translate those high-level corporate principles into their day-to-day work. I've been amazed at the depth of our leadership commitments, and they've touched everything from how we do data collection to how we create culture, to even creating an open environment and committing to the work of helping our employees learn and how to think about the space. So we have really quick worksheets that we use, simple questions about why a project's being pursued that provoke discussion and help people kind of write through their commitments. We have some Mad Lib style ones like this as well that just are kind of like, let's start with something and get your mind moving. We've created a lot of case studies as well that are inspired by real world events and issues that are arising from the intersection of tech and society. And these give people complex problems to think through so they can start to exercise their critical thinking. And it also gives them that safe space again to critique and analyze a piece of technology in that environment in the context of a case study. The second pillar around responsible innovation is really about diversity, inclusion, and we believe deeply in the value of this concept. And it's really about creating that space for input, perspective, challenging dominant views, operating in a transparent way, leveraging experts, talking to impacted groups. And in particular, the thing that I think is most important is ensuring that the projects are vetted against competent and diverse individuals who might even object to the work, and making sure that you create the space for that. Because we all recognize that without this diversity, dominant systems will reproduce and maintain themselves. We know this, that dominant groups are really challenged to even think about their dominance. So this idea of listening to others and incorporating feedback, even when it's uncomfortable, is a key element to how we think about responsible innovation. And one of the things that my team does in particular is that every time we work on a new technology, we intentionally choose a community of users that's at risk of being excluded, given what we know about the technology. And so this includes those from the LGBTQ community, racial minority groups, women, introverts, and so many other groups, because we believe that if we address the needs and concerns of these marginalized communities, we can better address the needs of a broader range of people. And so I think we all recognize this, right? Diversity is not a bit that you flip. There's many different facets to diversity, and depending on the tech being developed and the context, and the harms that can be introduced, there's different groups of users that you need to consider and intentionally bring into the development process. So we've created a lot of methodologies around recruiting diverse voices, how we facilitate discussions between stakeholders and engineers, how we respond to the feedback, how we integrate it back into the product, how we even track it and hold teams accountable. So there's a whole set of methodologies stemming from user research to all the way that projects are managed and the way that things go at the door that handle input from the communities that are affected by tech. And as an example, in our speech transcription technology, one of our starting points to determine who would benefit the most and discover who would be excluded from those benefits was around meetings. And so we know that meetings by design favor extroverts, those who are more vocal and assertive and social. And so we focused intentionally on introverts for this project because by definition, they are less vocal and less likely to benefit from the transcription technology in meetings. And so out of this work arose a multitude of product improvements, and this actually benefited everyone. And so I think there's a blog post coming out about it today on our Microsoft Design Medium channel, and it describes this work in much more detail if you are interested and want to look it up. And then this third area is really about learning how to think ahead and look around corners. We know that technology has been the catalyst for dramatic changes and the locus of power. So when special tools become available to carry out particular functions, we know that the success of those tools and tasks will by necessity encourage the further use of those tools. And sometimes these are then adapted to uses that weren't originally envisioned. And so we have to think really deeply about some of those unintended consequences and what are some of those likely outcomes and uses. And I say this a lot in my day-to-day, you know, there's no such thing as just introducing a new piece of technology. Everything changes when one thing changes. Even the introduction of a dishwasher changes the patterns and routines and relationships of a family. So it's really quite transformative every time we insert technology into an ecosystem. So we actually did a lot of work over the last few years just going through and creating a really robust definition of harm and the categories of harm and the categories of impact. And so there's a really rich set of vocabulary and taxonomy that we've published around categories of harm that we think are problematic. And so we've created frameworks to help us then model out those scenarios and build out mitigation plans. And this really has parallels in how we think about threat modeling in our security space. So we think it's important to have a process for examining the impact of our stakeholders in a more, robust way. Oh, I think that's one of my apps making a noise. Okay, so really what we're doing here is we want to make sure that when we do these types of modeling exercises, we have a really good understanding of how we can then create really robust mitigation plans. And so I mentioned this, we've written about this as a whole framework and process around modeling harm. It's been shared online. You can take a look and see that category and taxonomy that we've created. But one of the most critical pieces of understanding emerging technology is understanding context, because the use cases matter. And so we want to be able to understand what new possibilities are unlocked, and then what ends up happening to the spectrum of users, who's affected, their value systems and how they play into this. And so we need to understand all the different ways that can influence the types of mitigations that we develop, because there's different types of mitigations based on system errors versus misuse versus exploitation, malicious use. And so we'll have different types of tools to handle those as well. A big thing that my team also spends time on is examining the infrastructure that starts to emerge, because once a piece of technology is widely accepted and standardized, that relationship between tech and users change. And so users no longer have the same scope. They might even matter less. And we don't want to create this type of relationship, right? We want to make sure that we don't actually favor the infrastructure over users. And so the fourth item here is really about responsiveness. And we know that this is such a shifting landscape. We're really doing a lot of norm building right now, and it's occurring at a rapid pace. We know that we have to be able to respond in an agile manner. And as new knowledge and new perspectives emerge, we need to be able to be nimble in our response. We can't be stuck in a certain way of doing things. And one thing we spend a lot of time looking at is social acceptability. Because when you look at tech, most tech assessments that have been done with end users are really focused on like usability, acceptability, utility, those types of things. But we have to move beyond this and evaluating a person's psychological comfort with technology. So again, we've created a set of research methodologies to help us understand where the lines of social acceptability are, so we can be more thoughtful about how we develop some of our more bleeding edge technologies and where we put real barriers and constraints in place, because we as a society are not there, or maybe never will be there yet for certain things. So we need to understand what are all the different factors that influence norms and perspectives. And first, I'll share with you like a little bit of a framework here. And clearly there's a lot of factors that come into influencing perspectives and norms. But on one hand, there is that socio-political environment, right? This is that overarching environment that instills feelings of fear or security or trust with technology. There is your lived experience and the type of relationship you want to have with a piece of technology. And then there's the context in which a piece of technology might manifest. So you might be comfortable with some technologies being present in an airport because of safety reasons. It's very likely that you would not be comfortable with those same technologies being present in a grocery store. And so there's obviously a lot of factors that influence norms and perspectives, but we need to understand these big three at least to understand how technology works and is accepted around the world. And so I thought I'd give you an example of some of the research we did on sociopolitical variations on trust. This was done a few years ago. We did some ethnographic work exploring the variations of trust of technology around the world. It's obviously evolved, but in the US, there was large skepticism towards both corporations and governments. I think at the time there had been a lot of data breaches and people really didn't feel like anyone was looking out for their best interest. They really felt like they were on their own. And you contrast that with feelings of people who spoke to us from in China, and there were higher amounts of trust in that system because it was, the corporations and the government were operating in lockstep. And so there was the perception that this was more beneficial to the larger society. And then when we went into Germany, we saw a completely different model here where there was a lot more trust in government to protect its citizens, really not a lot of trust towards corporations. And so for a global company like Microsoft and for teams like mine that work within it, we need to understand what some of these larger patterns are and what those attitudes are around technology. So we do quite a bit of research around the world to understand how we need to introduce technology in a thoughtful way that works for the geographical and geopolitical environments. And so this last slide is a little bit meatier. I'm going to kind of go through some deeper examples. But this last pillar of responsible innovation is about designing technology more intentionally and technology that's fit for purpose. This is where all of the rest of these pieces really come into play and it comes together. And so I think I've mentioned this a few times. We've established our core ethics principles at the company. It's been about 4 years that we've had these across fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusion, transparency and accountability. And these are the underpinnings of so much of our work. You'll see these threads kind of weaving throughout the work that we do. And I'll walk you through 5 examples around responsible data collection, things we're doing around tooling, stuff we're doing around user experience design, how we handle deployment and use guidance, and even gating and access to technology. So I'll kind of illustrate a few of these. The first being around data collection. We've spent an enormous amount of time thinking about fair and diverse data collection methodologies, how we handle data collections around the world, how much we pay for them, because those shift around the world, and they actually have interesting effects and incentives in communities. Demographic data that's not limited to this, but age, gender, ethnicity, these explain a lot of the variability that exists among our populations and users. And we think about some of these differently around the world. And so we have to understand that as we go and collect data. My team has put together sampling plans across the demographic spectrum, and we prioritize the factors that really have the larger effects on performance of our technology. We try to ensure that communities that are typically excluded are represented. We work with teams to select vendors to work with and helping to train the moderators that interface with people. The types of data that we've worked with most closely are, eyes for HoloLens to do eye tracking, faces, gestures, people movements, looking at places and objects, and even speech. And so there's quite a lot of variability in the types of data that we have our hands in and how we collect and manage all of that. On the tooling side, we've been doing a lot of work. I call it putting ethics in the code path. So, really forcing people down a certain path so that it's just a part of the way that they develop their technology. And so we created a tool called error terrain analysis. Our researchers shared this. I think it was shared last year. But what it does is it extracts conditions where the clustering of model errors occur. And it's designed to sit within the developer code flow. It helps developers improve the overall system. It's really a multifaceted, in-depth error analysis. And it helps us answer questions like, is this model equally accurate for demographic groups? And are there any environmental or input contexts where the model performs significantly better or worse? And we actually used this tool to help us identify lots of bugs in our code, even issues where we had sensors malfunctioning during data collection that were producing, faulty results in our models. And so that helped us identify things in the field that weren't operating well and replace that. So, so we have a lot of tools like this that we've created internally. We've actually shared some of them externally as well. And then in terms of our design approach, how we think about user experience design, there's really 4 big chunks. One obviously being around, human-centered design and looking at the whole human, including the ecosystem and the environment that people live in. Inclusive design, and I mentioned this, solving for distinct needs and then using that to improve the overall product. Modeling out harms, and then thinking about the value tensions, and even where there are tensions between the people designing a product or service and then the values of the people that are using it and interacting with it. And as one example on the experience design, we've actually done a lot of thinking around where we intentionally insert friction into the system, because while creating a seamless experience is often a wonderful philosophy to pursue, there's many benefits to it. There are times where we want to insert mini speed bumps where we can enable conscious decision making. And so this is where we put controls in place around privacy and identity and exchanges of information. So as an example, we've been doing a lot of work around consent, especially meaningful consent. Like, what does it mean to have real consent and control? And this is where we put speed bumps in place so we can have this transparent exchange between our users. And when we think about meaningful consent, we're thinking about awareness. Do they understand? Is there no doubt of what they're being asked for? Can they accurately describe it in their own words? Do they feel like they have choice, that they're not being coerced? And do they have real control over their information and data? And so this is a framework we've created. It's a set of designs, specs, practices that are being woven throughout Microsoft and a lot of the services that are being created. In terms of deployment and use guidance, this year we recently released a new service called Spatial Analysis. It lets you understand the movement of people in space. And what we did here was, as part of our documentation, there are 3 big components. The first one was a transparency note that was really about the intended use cases and the characteristics that limit the performance of this technology. The second bucket was really understanding all of the work that was done around security and privacy and all those measures that were put in place. And lastly, a set of deployment recommendations. And this included recommendations around disclosure. And we also created a little prototype for our developers to see exactly what we meant by those disclosure recommendations. And we gave them something to look at and use as a reference model. There are a lot of questions we were looking at with this piece of tech, especially around COVID, how we preserve privacy and maximize personal privacy, and how we balance information overload around disclosure, because we don't want to give people pages of disclosure information. We want to do it in real speak. And then how does this technology augment what people are already doing, right? Because we don't want this technology to replace people. This is really meant to augment the work and make people's lives easier and more effective. And then lastly, really on these sets of examples was about availability and access. And so there's work that we did around a service called Custom Neural Voice. And really what this is a synthetic speech service, because we've had massive breakthroughs where we can have really small set of samples of audio, and we can create a voice font of an individual person from this very small set of utterances. You can imagine all of the great use cases, right? And you can also imagine a number of harmful ones. And so when we started working on this project, one of the first things we did was we did a landscape analysis. We took a really holistic perspective of this ecosystem so that we could understand, what does the synthetic media ecosystem look like? We interviewed voice actors. We needed to understand what protections needed to be in place for people in this job. We ultimately created a set of robust terms of use, a code of conduct for anyone using this service, transparency and consent requirements when working with voice talent, so they understand that this technology is incredibly powerful and it will change the relationship between them and the company that is recording their voice. We created principles for how we protect the content and voice owners from the proliferation of fake and misleading content. We made a list of acceptable use cases, and ultimately we gated access to this technology, and it's still gated right now because we feel like it's quite sensitive. We were very transparent. We blogged about this as well. We redetailed our thinking and our commitment to work with human rights groups to really look at the implications of this tech, and then design appropriate mitigations. So we're trying to be really thoughtful about the work and intentional, and sometimes we'll slow down intentionally just so that we can do this in the right way. And I'll put this, quote out there. It's something that our president has said a lot. The sense of responsibility really runs deep in our company. It's quite inspiring. Brad says, when your technology changes the world, you bear responsibility to help address the world you've helped create. And so this is something that I think maybe it's because Microsoft's an older company. We've been through antitrust, we've been through so many different things, but this sense of responsibility is really woven into the culture and the work that we're doing. And so that's really quite incredible. And so let me take a step back, talk about the big picture. I walked you through a lot of details and on the ground work that we're doing, but zooming out for a second, I think we need to recognize that technologies need not be used in the way that we use them today, or even how Hollywood envisions them, right? It's not a question of either no technology or putting up with the current ones. And I think we should actively push back against technological determinism. Those are conversations we have all the time. And the way that I think about this is that ethical thinking isn't really a tax. It's not done after the fact. It's an opportunity. It's innovation material. And we take a very design and human-centered approach with this. And this is an approach that we build from the very beginnings of product development. And so if we come in with that right mindset, we actually shape product in the right way, right from the beginning, versus coming in at the end and then trying to put Band-Aids all over a solution. So what I'll do right now is I'll just kind of stop right here and say thank you for listening. I did a lot of talking, so maybe I'll open it up for questions. And if there are comments or you want me to drill into something I shared, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Mira. For the audience, please put your questions into chat, and I'd be happy to ask them.
And for Mira, if you can stop sharing the screen, I can spotlight both you and Mira.
Will do.
Thank you, David. Okay, so while we're waiting, I just had a question stepping back. So I think you mentioned a couple of really interesting technologies, and you sort of hinted at early on about how you did a quick experiment with your art, and now you're looking at using neural voice. And so as an artist yourself, can you just say a little more about how you felt having your art replaced in that computer environment? Because I think it's a really interesting issue, and you might have some perspective on that. So.
Yeah, I was actually originally really excited to see what I could do with it, because I didn't really feel threatened by the technology here. I thought it could be used as a tool. So to me, it felt like just another extension of my hand, the way I would use a paintbrush, or the way that I would use, I don't know, After Effects or something like that. And so there was a lot of hype at the time. It was like, oh my God, AI is going to replace artists, and look at all the amazing art that AI is doing. This piece of art got 15,000 at Christie's during an auction or something. And so I was curious about it. There's a lot of curiosity, not a lot of fear, but I felt like there's a little bit of an overhype. And what got me excited was every morning I would wake up and I'd look in this folder, and there'd be like hundreds, sometimes even 1,000 images that were popped out. Most of them were not that interesting, but there was a few that you could kind of sift through. And I thought that there's some gems in there. And what was really interesting is that as an artist, you sometimes have this blank canvas problem. You're not quite sure where to start. And so for me, I think these were really great starting points. And so it was just, to me, it was like another tool. I think the part that's challenging here is if you're not technically savvy in that art world, you could get left behind. And so that part, got me a little concerned. And then I had real questions around just copyright and authorship, because it's not hard to go and scrape people's artwork online and then create a neural net that mimics that artwork. And so there's real questions around even music. Like, let's say I went and scraped someone's and took 3 pieces of music and blended it, used a neural net to then create something that was inspired by it. Do I credit the work? And what is that relationship between the input and the output? And so I think that there's a lot of questions around that we haven't really even talked about yet in a meaningful way.
Thank you. So we have a question from Ramadi. What is the standard that you use at Microsoft to judge whether someone is ethical or not?
Oh, what is the standard you use, whether something's ethical or not? So this is actually a really complex problem. I wish that there was like an easy answer to say, hey, we use this framework, or we use some sort of like, I don't know, utilitarian type of framework or something. It's actually very, very complex. And so one of the big things we do is with every piece of AI, and we're not doing it across the system yet, but we're working on it, is that we do something that is really looking at the impact of that technology and understanding what that impact is. And we have a category of technology and use cases and scenarios where we say if anything touches these, it needs to go through an additional review board. And that review board will put additional constraints in place. And so what we've done is put a lot of process in place to examine it, because I think from the abstract sense, you could put some things in place. But because we're a company that has so many different types of technology, from consumer facing to platforms, and we have complex relationships with vendors and like a rich ecosystem, people that build on top of us, it's not a straightforward, here's a list and an approach. So I'll say that it's very, very complex. And what we do is we force everyone to do that like depth of work in understanding their technology and really thinking about who could be impacted and how, documenting it. We have a set of review processes and oversight committees that look at certain technologies, and then we say, okay, well, what are we going to do about this? We have concerns. We're concerned about how it might impact like synthetic voice. We're concerned that this is going to impact our democratic process. Well, we want to hold this one back. And so it's a little bit of a complex answer.
Yeah, so I have a follow-on question from Andrea, and says, how can we as humans learn to hear all the diverse voices using the computers and apps? I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I think that that's a fantastic question. And I think that this notion of like, how do you hear them, or how do you even know about what all the diverse voices is a challenging one. And so I don't know like who this we is, Andrea, as you're asking about this. When I think about like, how do we think about it as technology builders, we actually have roles at Microsoft that are specifically about that interface between our end users, and their roles we're augmenting them to do this diverse voices work. And so they're not just doing that, acceptance testing, but they're going out and listening to them, to those voices, and then trying to, weave their perspectives back in where they have concerns around, hey, I want disclosure here, I want to know, or I want limits here. We try to weave that back into the requirements of what's being built.
Thank you. So how do you determine what is socially acceptable in a society with the large spectrum of opinions? And
yeah, that's also another hard question. So I'll see if I can talk about this a little bit in the abstract, because we're doing this on a piece of technology that hasn't been released and it's fairly confidential. But the thing that we're doing around social acceptability is, again, this is through like qualitative interviews. And then what we do is we actually have a scoring system where people talk about the various facets of technology of the system we're releasing, and where they are like, I'm more likely to use this in this environment, I'm less likely to use it here. Here's why I have concerns around using this piece of technology. And that's where someone who's intentionally bought that piece of technology. And then what we do is we also do a set of interviews and surveys around people that might be bystanders or affected by it, but they didn't actively opt into using that piece of tech. And we want to understand what are their perceptions of someone who has chosen to buy that piece of technology. And so we start looking at the intersection of those. And then what we might say is, you know what, there is so much concern here on the bystanders side. We're actually going to put our thumb on the scale there. And we're going to limit some of the types of sensors we put in this technology, or we're going to limit some of the use cases because there is this pushback around or discomfort around it. And so it's an art. It's not exactly a science, but it is through that qualitative research and then the quantitative surveys that follow afterwards as well.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears a little. There's a question here, which is more about your background. I think it's still a really interesting question. Wanting to know more about how you got into this work and how much you do coding. Do you have a PhD in computer science? So they're really asking about, and also about Microsoft. They're interested to know why, how this type of work is occurring there. So.
Oh, I mean, Microsoft is such a large company. So I have a background in computer science. I don't have a PhD. I have a bachelor's in math, which is super helpful in the space of AI, where a lot of it is just math. And so I do some coding on the side. I get into things because I ask questions. And the fortunate part, and this is where I feel a little old sometimes too, where I say, hey, I've been at Microsoft for 16 years. But the nice thing about being at a company for that long is you start to understand that soft network really well. And so, when I wanted to go and do these experiments, I could just reach into my network and say, hey, who's doing something like this? Who can I partner with? And it's a company where if you have a question and you have an idea, there's a large network to connect with and just like do something with it. And so I often start a lot of these through questioning. The team that I started, I actually wrote a paper and about the need for artists and the need to think differently in the space of AI. And I shared it with a set of VPs that I'd worked with and said, hey, who wants to fund this? Is anyone interested in letting me do this work? And one of the VPs said, I'm interested, and let's talk about what that looks like. And I might have a job on my team. And so, so that's how I handled the creation of Ethics and Society, because at the time there really wasn't an ethics team in our company that was working in the engineering stack. So, so that I did through just, promoting an idea and shopping it around. It was a little bit like trying to get a startup funded within a large company.
Thank you. So another question on another topic from Suman. Great talk. I was curious about the tool AI clustering. How does it quantify the fairness, and what does the future look like in terms of fairness?
I mean, hard question right there. Just what does the future look like in terms of fairness? But what happens in that AI, the clustering tool, is it's actually not clustering on fairness. It's clustering on errors and where errors are happening. And so this is where the output might be different from your ground truth. And so what's happening here is it's taking all of your facets, it's taking all of your attributes and looking at the outputs of your model and doing a clustering exercise. And what that lets you do is you can then set thresholds of like, where do you want to set the threshold around error? And it lets you kind of navigate that tree and look at clusters you wouldn't have seen before because they might have been hidden in kind of the larger pile of errors. And so it's really about traversing that the tree of errors and then understanding, well, hey, there's a facet here that is maybe a demographic attribute. And so we're seeing an issue around fairness that's being masked through errors. And so I'll give you like a really concrete example. We were looking at some of our face recognition technology, and we saw errors around what appeared to be race. And so we said, hey, this tech right now, it looks like it's not favoring a certain category of people, and it looks like it's maybe biased in that way. And so we started going through the errors using this tool, and we realized that what the model was actually doing is it was handling people with short hair who weren't wearing eye makeup a certain way. And then when we looked at the data, we realized that data had a large overlap with a certain racial population that we had collected as well. And so what looked like a race and bias issue ended up being we need more people with longer hair and people with eye makeup, or we were missing this. And so we start to see things that are masked, and that's what this tool lets you do. And then your question on what does the future look like in terms of fairness? The way that I like to think about this is that your product or service works equally well across your cohorts and groups of that you've identified. And so it works equally well, it works equally bad. And so when you think about fairness, we're saying we want to make sure that your face recognition service works equally well for people with light skin, with dark skin, with different skin tones that are, people of different gender, and that it works equally poorly as well. And so that we are not having disproportionate errors across those types of spectrums. And so I think when you look at fairness, it's a really complex issue. When you look at something like speech, does it work well across ages, genders, accents? When you look at face, it's different. When you look at, mapping people in spaces? Does it work across body types, accessibility issues, children? And so there's lots of different attributes there. And what we try to do is encourage teams to look at their technology in the context in which it's used, and then kind of break down the subgroups and make sure that it works equally well, equally poorly across those demographics.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question that was a follow-up from a previous question, and then I encourage people to keep talking afterwards in the social hour. So it says, since people, different people, especially cultures and religions, have very different ideas about what is right and wrong, what makes these, who makes these judgment calls, and who's qualified to make a call on what's ethical or not?
Yeah, we have had a lot of debate and discussion about this. And again, I think that this is one where it's complex. And so what we try to do is we've talked a lot about, like, what is the separation between business ethics and your personal ethics? And what is the business trying to do? And then how do you, as an individual, as an autonomous person with, your feet, you can choose what you want to work on and whether you want to be at the company. Where do you opt into the work? And so as a company, we have a certain set of values. We're very public about those values and a certain way of operating. And so we make decisions as a company on the categories of work we want to be in. And then what we also try to do is, in certain categories, like military, for example, right? There's a lot of stuff in the news about Microsoft and doing work with the Department of Defense. How do people who personally do not believe in that category of work choose to opt in or out? If they choose to opt in, how do they have off ramps later on if they choose, like, no way, I've actually decided this is not in line with my personal values. And so we're trying to create a system that allows the business to operate according to its values, and then people to be able to work within that framework where they have the flexibility to be able to move around as well, especially on some of the ones that are thornier, I guess to say. But again, like, it's not like there's an individual who's saying this is ethical and this isn't. We try to create a framework around how to operate in these spaces.
Okay, thank you. I think I might be able to get away with one more question, and then David's going to kick us off. So Prem asks, says, thanks for a great talk about all the great initiatives at Microsoft. I wonder if the tight labor market for tech workers is driving ethical imperatives. In other words, how much are the ethical imperatives driven bottom up versus top down? And would these change under labor market changes?
I think I'd want to follow up with Prem on this question a little bit. Because I want to, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna let you think about it. I think
a little bit more.
Maybe you can join us at on the Discord channel afterwards.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I think this is a great segue. I will pass it back over to David. Thank you for a fantastic talk. If people want to unmute and clap, or just show your video and clap.
Wave via the video is also a good way to go. Thank you very much, Mira.
Thank you.
Thanks for running things, Myra. Yeah, so right now we're going to be transitioning over to the social hour. Again, what we do there is we all move to Discord. There's coffee breaks rooms 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are your preferred rooms for hanging out and talking to each other. Please join us there. If you just watch these videos and you don't join us in the social session, then nobody knows that you were even here. So remember, it's very important to build community, to join us in the social session. I hope you guys and gals had a great time. Here's some music for your way out.